Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis here. This week in American history, we're going to examine the United States in the post-Cold War era. So 1990, 1991 to present. And this moves us towards a consideration of the United States in the 21st century, understanding where the United States is at today, how the past informs these changes and developments, and how understanding history might better inform us moving forward in the 21st century. The photos that you see here, which I'll talk a bit about, and please summarize these in the bonus points factoid for this week. These photos, I'm going to talk about each of these. This, of course, is George H.W. Bush. He was, of course, Ronald Reagan's vice president. He becomes president, inaugurated in 1989. This is George H.W. Bush. He was a one-term president. He lost his election to Bill Clinton, largely because of economic reasons. The United States economy fell into a recession following the Persian Gulf War. George H.W. Bush, who had pledged no new taxes, was forced, because he was trying to be a responsible leader, that as a result of economic issues, forced to raise taxes. And of course, this, coupled with the recession, really cost George H.W. Bush the presidency to Democrat from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. This is George H.W. Bush on Thanksgiving Day in 1990. He is greeting troops in the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Shield, which was the sort of build-up operations prior to Operation Desert Storm, now today known as the Persian Gulf War of 1991. The build-up to the Persian Gulf War began in 1990, following, of course, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. These are protesters in Seattle, Washington, protesting the World Trade Organization's meeting. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. And down here is the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, where in 2003, George W. Bush gave a speech in which he announced that the war in Iraq, that the mission was accomplished, that the major combat operations had ended. And of course, that was in 2003. And of course, that conflict in Iraq was just beginning to descend into its most violent phase. The vast majority of Americans and combatants in general died in Iraq after that speech. So, America in the post-Cold War world, and again, please summarize some of the key themes in the extra credit discussion forum for this week. When the Cold War ended, this was a moment where Americans sort of unanimously perceived that the United States had won the Cold War. Though I think if you examine the collapse of the Soviet Union more closely, that it seems more apparent that the Soviet Union collapsed more so than it being defeated, shall we say, by an outside force. The Soviet Union was really a formal empire in Central and Eastern Europe that had been built to a large degree on political coercion and occupation of local populations who had long enjoyed an identity, a national identity, and an appreciation for sovereignty. And if you study the history of the Soviet Union, you know that revolutionary activities within the various countries of the Soviet bloc to gain independence was not a thing that just began with Gorbachev. Hungary, 1956, Poland, 1956, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, just a couple of examples of that. So the Soviet Union's economic and political empire really collapsed. When it collapsed, the United States increasingly sensed that it would be the world hegemonic power Scholars of international relations theory, oftentimes refer to the 1990s as the unipolar moment. Remember, the Cold War was unique because it was an age of global bipolarity, where effectively, yes, you had a non-aligned movement that sort of in the world played with both the United States and the Soviet Union, but by and large, you had two major powers that were at competition, competing with each other in a sort of standoff, and the world was sort of divided. You didn't have a free movement of peoples between these areas. You did not have open trade between these areas. You did not have, in many cases, even normalized diplomacy during parts of this period of time. Very fundamental, differing ideological and economic perspectives. So the Cold War was a bipolar moment where the world was divided between the United States, its allies, its ideology, and the Soviet Union, its allies, and its ideology. When the Soviet Union collapsed, at the time that this occurred, between 1989 and 1991, Ukraine, of course, gaining its independence in 1991 in an event that is generally regarded as the end of the Soviet Union. When that occurs, there's no other major superpower, if you will, on the planet to challenge the United States. It was viewed that during the 1990s that the United States would be the world global hegemonic power, hegemon. That it would effectively dictate the terms of governance, of economics, trade, and so forth, by and large. Okay, it was perceived as the unipolar moment, where now you had a globalized world that would be largely under the leadership and direction of the United States. Of course, there was a great deal of misunderstanding there, or shall we say, overconfidence, and certainly examining the rise of China, which benefited greatly from trade agreements with the United States. It was not perceived that China would be a challenging partner in the world, and of course, a challenging player in the world, and of course, today, China really is the foremost competitor to the United States, and many scholars might suggest that the 21st century might be the Chinese century, if the 20th century should be regarded as America's century, as it often is. So, the unipolar moment, okay, this period of time where the United States really emerged jubilant in a way, if not apprehensive about the end of the Cold War, its rise into a position of centrality as the world sort of power. The United States in 1990 and 1991 entered into an operation in Iraq to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. Of course, you see George H.W. Bush here, as I mentioned, during Desert Shield with soldiers. Of course, this opens the door to an eventual, during his son's presidency, George W. Bush, two very significant wars in the Middle East, the war in Afghanistan, and of course the war in Iraq. And here you see, as I mentioned, the mission accomplished banner on the Abraham Lincoln for George W. Bush's speech, in which he declared major combat operations over in Iraq. This was following the tragic September 11th attacks, which of course were perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. At least to the best of our knowledge, we know that Al-Qaeda, under the direction of bin Laden, was considered responsible for the attacks on the World Trade Centers, as well as the Pentagon, on September 11th, 2001. This created a new era in terms of foreign policy for the United States. And I'll come up here to the WTO in just a second. The Cold War, though, was really based on more or less a defensive philosophy. It was centered around the idea of containment. So if you had the forces of communism on the advance, seeking to overthrow a non-communist ally, then the United States would fight to contain that ally in a war that in theory was defensive. It did not, containment policy theorists, though you had lots of proxy wars and sort of insurgent level activities, clandestine activities, generally speaking, until the Reagan doctrine and the Reagan offensive of the 1980s. The status quo of containment policy theory was that it was defensive and that it would not overtly promote the offensive regime change of another power in the context of the struggle of the Cold War. That really changes. And of course, between the major powers, you also have this idea of deterrence, right? Mutually assured destruction, nuclear deterrence. But that idea, the defensive idea of containment, it changes with the unipolar moment. Particularly, it changes with the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, where the United States, under the leadership of George W. Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney, would create what becomes known as the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine was very much the counter of containment policy, which said you would react. If there was an aggressive attack against an ally, you would seek to contain it. You would supply allies, you would support them to contain any expansion of Soviet communism. Well, the war on terrorism, the global war on terrorism, was really based on this idea that if the United States deemed a threat, a potential future threat, to be occurring from a place, another country, particularly in the guise of terrorism, that it reserved the right to preventatively attack that country or preemptively attack that country. It's not really, they called it preemption. In international relation theory, it's not really preemption. Preemption in sort of military understanding is to preempt an assault that is inevitable. A preventative war is where you effectively take the action prior to what you deem to be an eventual likely scenario, and you take the action to benefit your geopolitical status. So this is the Bush Doctrine. The idea of the Bush Doctrine is that if you see a future threat potentially on the horizon, that the United States would reserve the right to begin a war, an offensive war against that threat. And of course, it applied that most significantly to the country of Iraq following September 11th. Iraq had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. That's a well-established understanding. There was a claim of the weapons of mass destruction program. Of course, that was highly overstated and challenged by the international nations when the claim was made. But this idea that they might be a future threat was used by the Bush administration to launch a preventative war against Iraq, which ousted the regime of Saddam Hussein in 2003. So this is a new era of American international relations. Initially in the 90s, you had this more sort of calculated. This was the Persian Gulf War was based on what was called the Powell Doctrine, which was a reaction, that's from Colin Powell, and that was a reaction to the Vietnam War and how problematic the Vietnam War came as it drug on and on and on. The Powell Doctrine said, don't get involved in a war unless you know you can achieve the objectives, unless you can clearly achieve the objectives in a meaningful amount of time, because having an unpopular, sort of unsustainable, long-term war is not good for the United States, it's not good for the world, it's not good economically, it's not good politically. And so Colin Powell, the Powell Doctrine was really a reaction to the sort of developed quagmire that became the Vietnam War. The Bush Doctrine, which of course embodied here, particularly as it relates to the 2003 war in Iraq, the Bush Doctrine was really casting off the Powell Doctrine, and instead saying that the United States should promote preventative war, that it should promote wars that will be used to oust regimes, offensive wars that will remove potential future threats. And that really spoke to the sort of confidence, overconfidence probably, of the United States in this unipolar moment, where it felt it had sort of free arm leverage to do this. I don't think historians long term are going to see this as a very advantageous sort of policy of the United States long term. And there's a number of reasons for that. Last one I want to talk about here, I'll give you a couple extra points because I know this is long. The WTO protests. So the World Trade Organization. In the post-Cold War era, you had the creation of the World Trade Organization, which replaced a smaller organization called GATT from the Cold War era. The World Trade Organization, though, becomes the center of significant controversy as the United States in in this unipolar moment becomes, among other countries, a real champion of sort of globalization and global free trade. You had during the 90s the signing of NAFTA. Then you had during the Bush administration the signing of an even more significant free trade agreement. Then during Obama's presidency, there was a very pretty controversial Pacific trade agreement. The globalization, the era of globalization post-Cold War becomes really controversial for Americans. And in the 1990s, in 1999, the World Trade Organization, which is centered in Geneva, Switzerland, was to have a meeting, an annual meeting in Seattle. And massive protests broke out there, as you see right here. And protesters, some of these protesters were there because they were opposed to free trade. Other protesters were there because they saw these globalization trade agreements as causing environmental destruction. Others were concerned about worker and labor rights. Regardless, though, what this really embodied in this post-Cold War era were now increasing sort of an increasing sense by Americans in middle and working class areas where it seemed that increasingly these types of agreements were squeezing the middle class, they were squeezing the working class, they were bad for workers, they were bad for the environment in the opinion of many Americans, while they benefited sort of those in power and corporations who were benefiting from lower cost manufacturing and so forth. And so, of course, the post-Cold War era in many parts of the United States becomes also associated with a loss of what at times were good manufacturing jobs. Certainly in places like Virginia, in the south side of Virginia, near places like Danville, Virginia, you see areas that used to be really strong furniture and textile manufacturing areas have faced very extreme economic decline. And this story plays out in many other areas. And so Americans started reacting to this, and they started to really push back on this idea that free trade agreements would sort of lift all boats. And you start to see this, and this, of course, has been a consistent theme, I think, in the United States since, but this was one of the first sort of real statements against this. So the United States in the unipolar moment and in the post-Cold War era. Summarize what you think are the most important points, interesting points for you, and I'll give you a few extra points because I know this is super long. Sorry about that, and let's have a great week, everyone.